Okay. Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design and the Department of Architecture, Design and Urbanism, and very soon, Department of Architecture, Construction Management, Design and Urbanism, or whatever we will be called, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final Arfaa lecture of this academic year. My name is Ulrike Altmüller-Lewis. I'm the Department Head for Architecture, Design and Urbanism, and this is Drexel's endowed Farajola and Mariam Bardi Arfaa lecture series. It was established in 1992 by architect, educator, and former department head Peter Arfaa in honor of his parents. For more than 3 decades, this lecture series has brought designers, scholars, and thinkers of the built environment to our campus. Each fall, winter, and spring, these public presentations invite us to consider contemporary, historical, professional, and theoretical dimensions of architecture, interior design, and urbanism, and they remain a highlight of our academic year. I would like to thank Dr. Daniel Koslett, Assistant Professor and Architecture Historian in my department, who is now organizing these events. We have a terrific website for the Arfaa lecture series, listing the over 90 speakers who honored us with their wisdom over the past 32 years, and you will see that we now also make recordings of these lectures available. New is also that we ask everybody to register. However, don't be scared, it's still free of charge, and we are not using it to check attendance, even though we might start with that. Lastly, we ask all students and faculty to remain seated until after the Q&A. Your instructors have been informed that you're here until approximately 7:30. Your classes are going to not run away. So this year's lecture series has coincided with the 250th anniversary of American independence, prompting us to think critically about how we celebrate achievement and commemorate struggle in and through the built environment. Earlier lectures considered the role of architects, engineers, and builders in giving form to the nation's founding and in representing the United States abroad today. Tonight, we turn to the architecture of memory itself and to the difficult, often contested work of memorializing what cannot be fully known or fully seen. Across the globe, we have seen monuments of despots, dictators being toppled, and here in the United States, at least until recently, communities debated the status of monuments that glorify Confederate leaders and soldiers. In this context, tonight's lecture, Unknown, Provisional Architectures of Memory, asks what kinds of architectural forms and aesthetic gestures might respond to histories marked by absence, archival silence, and the unknowable. Our speaker, Mabel O. Wilson, explores how provisional architectures, through mark-making, materiality, and sensorial experiences, might hold open space for difficult memories and compel us to confront the past while taking a stance in the present. Daniel Koslett will introduce her work and career in more depth in just a moment, but for now, please join me in thanking him for organizing this year's Arfaa lecture and in welcoming him to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrike, very much. Yes. We have been very fortunate this year with what I think have been a great series of lectures, beginning in the fall with Bruce's look at the role of past celebrations related to national events here in the city, and of course Sean Roberts last quarter talking about diplomatic contemporary architecture overseas. So it's a real privilege to introduce Mabel O. Wilson, who is with us tonight. We are indeed very lucky to have her with us this evening. Dr. Wilson is an architectural designer, a curator, and a cultural historian based at Columbia University in New York City. She is there the chair of African American and African Diaspora Studies Department, and also a professor at the university's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. From 2020 to 2023, she was the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, and she co-directs the Global Africa Lab. With her transdisciplinary practice, Studio and, Wilson is a principal collaborator in the architectural team that completed the award-winning Memorial to Enslaved Laborers at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, about which you will hear tonight. Exhibitions of her work have been featured at the Venice Architecture Biennale, SF MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, and beyond. Last spring, Dr. Wilson delivered the Andrew W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., 4 installments, which are all available online, and I would recommend. Professor Wilson has published quite a lot on Black culture, built environments, and race, and she's received numerous grants and accolades along the way, far too many for me to list off here. So I'll end by noting that she's a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Society of Architectural Historians. On a personal note, having spent some time at the University of Virginia and learned a great deal from Dr. Wilson's work, I am very pleased to welcome her to Drexel for this, our final Arfaa lecture. The title of her presentation, once again, Unknown, Unknown, Provisional Architectures of Memory. Without further ado, please, Dr. Wilson.
Good evening. Ooh, these lights are bright. I really can't see you all. But I hope you are all well. I know you are all winding down. Well, actually, you're in your 3rd term. You've got one more, am I correct?
This is the 3rd one, yeah.
This is the 3rd one, yeah. So you've got a little bit more to go. I just need to get this up. Okay. And I might tip this up. Perfect. Okay, so I am going to get started. So this site, as you've heard, and first I want to just say thank you, Daniel, for the invitation to come today. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ulrika, for the lovely introduction. And it just, it's just great to be here. Went to see, there's a really great show at the ICA on Shaker architecture. I lived in Kentucky for a while, so for me to kind of, see these Shaker artifacts was fantastic. I contributed an interview to the catalog and then went to see a great show by this painter, Noah Davis, actually, at the Museum of Fine Arts. And so there's much to see here, so I hope you guys can find some time to see what's in your city. And then I started here because I am actually writing about the President's House in Washington, D.C., so I really wanted to see this President's House in Philadelphia. And was very curious, one, to just see the scale of the site for my own work. I always, when I'm writing, I like to go to places, I've been writing about Mount Vernon, so I go to Mount Vernon, F Street in Washington, D.C., so I go there. It's helpful to kind of walk the site, those of you who, are working in the design field. So it was very important to sort of see here because the site has been making not just local headlines, but international headlines. And I've been thinking about, these questions about how architecture, but also art and many other things, can reveal histories about the social contract that binds us all, and the complex meaning of these humanist values that define how we see and how we know the world around us, right? Because those are very particular ways of knowing and being in the world. And I feel like, when one goes to historical sites, there are always narratives that are being told, and there are often spatial narratives that are being told. So, as you know, contested monuments, I would call this one a contested site, contested monuments, require that we better understand, how representations, how practices of memory, how narratives of history, and also politics impact how space is actually being made, right? And that also impacts, not just the construction, but oftentimes how things are also, and why things might be dismantled or taken apart. I would say the removals of the panels of the history of slavery, specifically at the President's House, but in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, in the US, at a historical site, which was the home of the Washington family, where slaveholding was practiced, right? And all of this, to me, just shows you how the intersections of public narratives about history, there is what has happened, but history is always what is said to have happened. Memory, how people experience the past, that's memory, are all shaped by power, right? So who determines what gets said or seen is really about power, right? And so really, to delve into this complex history of liberal democracy, right, 250 years, we have to ask how and why did the declared freedom of some rely upon the conditions and unfold it within spaces of unfreedom for others, right? And it's important to recognize that, history can't be erased. You can take the panels down, but this doesn't take this beautiful, well, it's, some people, yeah. This is an enormous painting by Edward Savage. He wasn't the best artist of his time. The Peels were much better. And they also painted numerous George Washingtons. But this is a famous painting, George Washington and his family. These are his step-grandchildren and his wife, Martha. So these were Martha Washington's grandchildren from another marriage. And, I've been interested in this painting precisely because of what it visually and spatially narrates, right? And it's a scene of what could be called, right? This is the planter class, so this is planter domesticity, right? And you can see how gender and race intersect, right? Washington and the grandson are on one side, Martha Washington and the daughter is on another. The son is sort of standing in front of the table, the daughter is sort of sitting behind. So they're very interesting gendered roles that are being played out here, right? And the son has got his hand on the globe, so the world is his. He has dividers in his hand, and those are for measurements. George Washington was a very skilled surveyor, very accomplished surveyor, right? And the map they're holding is for the map of what was then called Washington City, which is now Washington, D.C., which George Washington oversaw the sort of development and construction of, right? So it's a kind of narrative of the holdings of the Washington family, right? So you see both gender, but you also see the kind of formation of an understanding of racial difference, right? And also an understanding of property and nation. Edward Savage placed George Washington's young body servant, that's Christopher Shields, in the back. And to some respects, the inclusion of a house servant in this first painting of a first family represents how the historian Simon Giocondi has called, quote, slavery's powerful haunting of the culture of taste, end quote. So slavery was there, as part of, right, this narrative of the future of the nation, right, of the first family. So again, you can take the placards down, but there is evidence that locates Christopher Shields at the president's house. So this is a letter from a guy named Tobias Lear. He was George Washington's basically personal secretary. So he sort of writes this letter responding to a question that George, because they couldn't call each other up, they certainly couldn't text, so they would send letters back and forth, as you know. So this was a response to a letter Washington was wondering, because Pennsylvania passed one of the first acts to abolish slavery, which meant that if you came into Philadelphia or Pennsylvania and you owned an enslaved person, if you stayed there more than 6 months, after 6 months, that enslaved person was free. And that was a problem when you are now, this is, this law is passed exactly when, it's after the war, but this is when they're trying to meet and sort of establish, the Constitution. And so they're coming to Philadelphia to have those meetings, except the slaveholding members, which were a majority, were very concerned, right? And so you could see, it just says, the Attorney General conceived that after 6 months' residence, your slaves would be upon no better footing than his. He observed that if before the expiration of 6 months, they could, upon any pretense whatever, be carried or sent out of state, only for a single day, and that would commence on their return. So the 6 months. So if you get them out You could get them up, get them there 5 months and, 29 days, but on the 30th day, if they left and came back, it would restart another 6 months, right? And then, he says at the bottom, Mrs. Washington proposes in a short time to make an excursion as far as Trenton, that's outside of the state, and of course she will take with her Oni, Judge, and Christopher, Shields, which will carry them out of the state. So that in this way, I think the matter will be managed very well, right? So he's proposing, all right, how to manage this problem. So even in this letter, it just says, this is what was happening in the president's house. This is that site. Well, Oni had other ideas. She ran away. She escaped. She ran for her freedom, right? Because there were a number of free folks, free blacks in Philadelphia. And she got on a ship, went to New Hampshire, and lived the rest of her life as a free woman, right? But here's an advertisement that was placed in the Philadelphia Gazette in 1796. So here's the evidence, like she left. She was in that house and she left. More evidence, right? This is her telling her story, right? So this is her remembrance of what happened. And she tells it to the Granite Freeman, right? Granite State, New Hampshire. That's where she lived, she got married, she had children, that's where she passed away, right? And so, she's telling her story. So this is more evidence of what happened. And she says, yeah, I worked in the Washington household as an enslaved person, and I was to be given to that young girl that you saw in that first painting. Yeah, and so this shows that narratives, this is the evidence, but the narratives are also spatial, right? And that's what's important to remember. So, there is the evidence. You can take the panels down, but I don't know how you get rid of all of the evidence that basically pieces together what the story actually is, right? And so I'm teaching a class now, a seminar called Contested Grounds, and this week we read this really wonderful book by Delia Baudouin Wendell called Rwanda's Genocide Heritage. And she says, implicit in heritage's temporal and ontological registers is the perception of a past made present, right? So in time and how you are, your perceptual understanding of space, there is a sense of how the past is presented to you. Spatializing the past seeks permanence and, by extension, future representation and relevance, right? And so it's this way of thinking the past and the present and the future and the ways in which the future can be offer the opportunity for justice and redress, right? And so that's why it's important for these narratives to be made extant, right? For the past to emerge into the present so that there is, some kind of reckoning and redress. Right. And I just wanted to before I get into this, to say a little bit about race and how you can start to think about race. This is an allegorical painting. This is Liberty Freeing the Slaves by a British expat named Samuel Jennings. And, again, I used to teach this painting all the time in a class on urban theory that I taught for many years at the University of Kentucky. And again, it raised for me questions of nationalism, of architecture, of race. And you could see, the way in which racial difference in this painting articulates hierarchies of inequalities, right? But it also does so by making different spaces and also even different temporalities, right? So the emergence of, it's a social construction, but it is also very much a lived experience. But Liberty Freeing the Slaves was actually created for Philadelphia's library company. So this painting is in Philadelphia. The original, the building that it was painted for was designed by the British architect William Thornton, one of the architects for the Capitol, and it opened in 1791. And here you could see how Liberty, who is in this sort of space of enlightenment with the library's volumes of the arts and sciences, knowledge is within this neoclassical architecture, and it's symbolic of the classicism of this emerging, right, public sphere, right? That's why you see all of this classical architecture, right? And you could see she's got broken chains at her foot, so she is herself liberated, right? The idea of liberty being freed. This was a very popular kind of image in and narrative, right? And you can see how liberty is giving freedom to a group, to a Black family and a Black community. And they are just at the threshold of, let's say, the temple of reason, right? And they are celebrating outside in nature, right? And so you can kind of see like the way it's divided. There's nature on one side and culture on the other, right? And it's believed that the men, women, and children were waiting to board 2 ships on the Delaware River, back here, which were to take them and recolonize them back to Africa. And this is believed to either be Granville Sharp or a William Thornton, who were early advocates of this kind of recolonization and the formation in the British context of Sierra Leone. The US created Liberia for those same purposes, right, to basically self-deport. But anyway, what's important is this kind of space of knowledge, of geography, of music, of painting, heraldry, antiquity, mechanics, astronomy. Like, this is the world of knowledge, this is agriculture, philosophy, this is the index for the library, right? And that is the space of knowledge. Notice it's gridded and rational, and that is the space of nature, right? So it's kind of doing a work of saying the modern world of the Enlightenment, right, and this other kind of space of nature. So it produces a kind of the idea of the primitive and the idea of the modern, right? And this is the kind of work that these paintings actually do. And so the colonial encounters of Europeans with Asians and Africans and the indigenous in the New World, right, produces a kind of worldview that divides Western man, right, into the world of the modern and the civilized, the human, the self, the owner, whiteness, against, right, the more expendable non-human, the other, the owned, and the Black, right? So this is kind of the ways in which a kind of racial signifiers emerge, right? And they do certain kinds of work to produce hierarchies. Okay, so I just wanted to start with that to give a little context. And so I wanted to sort of talk about, well, what does it mean to remember slavery? And I'm going to talk about the memorial to enslaved laborers. Okay. So 2 years after the emancipation of enslaved peoples in the United States, at the end of the Civil War, Isabella Gibbons, who was a school teacher at the newly created Freedmen's School in Charlottesville, Virginia, wrote a letter in a March 1867 issue of the Freedmen's Record, which came out of Boston. And in her short, informative letter, Gibbons noticed that fellow white Southerners believed that Black citizens had forgotten the violence and terror of enslavement. So to keep someone in a state of bondage, you have to exert an extraordinary amount of violence so that they don't run, so that they, you have to basically keep them captive. Right, so she writes this letter. And Gibbons hadn't forgotten, and in her letter, she tells us what she remembers of slavery. And she says, "Can we forget the crack of the whip, cowhide, whipping post, auction block, handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from the mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten by these horrible cruelties hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not or ever will." And so here we see an undated photograph of Isabella Gibbons after her liberation. She actually learned to read and write while enslaved, which made her, once she was free, an ideal teacher in the Freedmen's School network that emerged after emancipation. Her dress, with its embellishments, declare her status as a member of a kind of emerging Black middle class. Note her hand is resting on a book, and that signifies her profession as an educator. And around her neck, we don't quite know, but it seems to me it's very common that women would have worn a watch sort of attached to their waist that they unclip and they would look at. And so I think, the way I read this photograph, it was an important possession because it was finally a sense that time was hers to claim, right? It was her time, not somebody else claiming her time. Now, learning to read and write was a skill punishable by beating. Again, this was a way of keeping you captive. At age 26, perhaps, she arrived as an enslaved cook at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, roughly around 1850. It's now believed that she was owned by a mixed-race woman, a black woman, in Charlottesville who was a milliner, so a woman who made hats. And she must have sold Isabella and I think maybe one of her siblings to pay off debts or something. And so she was purchased by a professor of natural philosophy named William Barton Rogers. And so he was a kind of mathematician, and he left UVA and was the founder of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. So the founder of MIT actually was a slaveholder. So as real property associated with the Pavilion 6, that's where Rogers lived, that's where she worked, she was sold to other professors. It was typical. Slaves were entailed, like passed on in wills or sold with the house, the land, the animals, the silver, and so on. And so Gibbons continued these duties, enslaved by other professorial families until she, her husband William, and servant also enslaved by a UVA professor, and their children were emancipated in March of 1865 with the arrival of Union troops to Charlottesville at the end of the Civil War. Right. So that shows you where Pavilion 6 is. If you've ever been to UVA, it's this really, important and unique actual space. I'm a UVA grad, so this is part of my working through my undergraduate obsessions. So Gibbons lived in Pavilion 6, and it was part of an ensemble of buildings that comprised the academical village designed by Thomas Jefferson in 1817. Jefferson was the third president of the United States. He was actually Secretary of State to George Washington. And when it opened in 1826, the 10 pavilions of UVA housed faculty and family. So the faculty and the family, you may know this from history, lived in the pavilions. Students lived below in the colonnades. And so it sort of, made this academical village, a very, very tight-knit community. So 125 typically white and male students lived in the rooms. There's the beautiful terrace lawn, and you can see at the end is the rotunda based on the Pantheon. And it's a kind of temple of reason, perfect Platonic geometry, right? And of course, it houses the library, right? Again, this Enlightenment idea of knowledge being essential to the advancement of humankind, right? So while in Jefferson's educational Eden, its white residents embarked on a daily journey of personal enlightenment and communal engagement, whose material needs were satisfied by the labor of slaves. For the enslaved, their daily routine unfolded under the regulatory authority of slave codes, which severely curtailed how they could move around and the basic freedoms of family and assembly. Enslaved workers, believed to be many of them very young, boys, fabricated and fired the close to a million bricks that made up the rotunda. Now, in his design for UVA, Jefferson carefully calibrated vistas throughout the grounds to strategically hide from view the spaces where slaves labored. He did this exact same thing at Monticello. All of the dependencies at Monticello are buried below ground. So he is thinking about the section, right? And I have this conversation with historian Lewis Nelson, that I think that this comes from Jefferson having lived in Paris and having the kind of density of Paris where things are stacked. So as the section through Pavilion 6 reveals, the careful terracing of the lawn allowed Jefferson to design pavilions that were 2 stories on the lawn side, but 3 stories on the back side, right, on the garden side. And this created a kind of lower level walkout basement, which housed the spaces where the enslaved worked and lived. So Isabella Gibbons and her husband often worked in poorly illuminated and ventilated kitchens and lived in quarters either below or in the workspaces. In the work yards, right? And so you could see the difference. I'm going to UVA tomorrow, so I will see all of this. And so they worked behind these incredibly beautiful serpentine walls. This is where people, the wash houses, the smoke houses, and other dependency could be found. And you could see that the postcard in 1910 on the right, this one, you could see how tall these walls are, right? This is by the 1930s. These become ornamental gardens, and this is the height today. So you could see how much lower. So really, these walls were really, really high to sort of hide, right, what was going on behind them. And so within the idyllic academical village, the enslaved lived under a constant threat of violence at any time. It could be from faculty or students, what were called hotel owners. These were the places where students ate. Could be university administrators or even physicals, both on grounds and off grounds. And this was to ensure unyielding obedience and compliance. And according to architectural historian Lewis Nelson, the academical village really functioned as a landscape of tyranny. And so what had often been rendered in the official historical narratives about the university's antebellum period from 1817 to 1865, and having been a student here, and the first thing they do is they send you out with a sketchbook to draw the lawn, you heard nothing of this story, right? So you never heard about the university's dependency on the enslaved men, women, and children, roughly 150 workers at any given time. And so like the fingerprints on the rotunda bricks, that history hid in plain sight for 155 years. And you could see this on a cartouche, right, which is typically found in a map. This was a map from 1820s. Here was an enslaved woman caring for the white child of a professor on the Widow's Walk of Pavilion 9, right? So in this cartouche, on this map that was printed and circulated everywhere, again, here's the evidence, right, of what happened, or at least what is said to have happened, right? So you may have recalled that in August of 2017, white supremacist groups stormed into Charlottesville, and they were there to protest the removal of 2 Confederate monuments. One to Robert E. Lee, the other to Stonewall Jackson. And the requisite expression of a figure, a name, historical dates, of monuments and memorials really are entangled in how power historicizes and whiteness territorializes its power. And I think it's one of the many forms of violent domination that Isabella Gibbons painfully recalls when she remembers her life enslaved, right? And she witnessed the birth of what is now called the lost cause. Therefore, when remembering who were enslaved in landscapes of tyranny like UVA, how does one reckon with the kind of racialized histories and forms of its very address that is foundational to how Western monuments, forms, articulate their histories, right? And in particular, the things that are not found in the archives, what are called silences in the archives. So in 2016, I joined architects Mi-Jin Yoon and Eric Haller. Mi-Jin's now the dean of Cornell School of Architecture. Mi-Jin and Eric have a practice in Boston. Local landscape architect Greg Bleem, artist Eto Ototigbe, and UVA professor of environmental conflict mediation, Frank Dukes. And we won a commission to design what was called the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers, an idea actually that originated in 2012 with UVA students. It's the students who've consistently held the university accountable for the telling of this narrative. So y'all have power, so don't be afraid to exercise it, because you can get results, far more than the faculty. So to engage in this really fraught commemorative landscape, we not only had to design a memorial, but integral to that process was to design a community engagement process to build really dialogue, understanding, and trust. There was no trust. There was little trust with the Black community of Charlottesville for many reasons. Constant gentrification and encroachment into Black neighborhoods, very segregated school system. New York Times wrote an excellent article about that. Questions about wages of workers on campus. So there was a lot of lack of, well, the university just never follows through with what they say, and we had to contend with that, right? So it was very important to try to build trust and to feel like people were being heard. And what we heard was that the memorial had to tell the unvarnished truth about the past to have any legitimacy. It needed to bring the community together to both learn and reflect on that history, and that meant everybody in Charlottesville. And people told us it had to reflect the dualities. So it had to show not only pain and suffering and the violence that Gibbons, but also the resilience and the dignity and the humanity of those who were enslaved, right? And we also heard very clearly, and this was very important, the first group we actually spoke with were the students who started the organization, the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers, right? So it needed to be a kind of living memorial to recognize that the work of this commemorative landscape remains incomplete in the wake of slavery, right? So again, this idea of redress in the future, and the students were very adamant about having a gathering space, right, to meet, right, and to catalyze, right, gatherings for whatever issues might come up in the future, right? And so here you could see the different kinds of spaces we were in. Churches, this is Ebenezer Church, this is the Jefferson School, this is a lab on campus that we met, and we had, we got, students were there, community people were there, here, just sort of talking about what it was, that they felt the work of the memorial had to do. And we listened, we didn't necessarily always agree with what everyone was recommending, but we felt it was important that we listen and that people felt that they were being heard. And we got a lot. We did not design anything until after this. So we were hired in August of 2016. We didn't do anything until January of 2017, and our meetings were slated for May of 2017. So we had to really work quickly. And then Charlottesville happened in August of 2017. I mean, Charlottesville in quotes, the Unite the Right rallies and all of that. So it was a complicated process, but this is what we ended up with. We designed a series of nested rings. This is the gathering space I mentioned. This is a kind of symbol of libation. This is a water feature that has the historical dates. These are the names and memory marks, right? So names are a part of it. And this is the figure, right? And so it's a representation of Isabella Gibbons, and so this comes together, right? And then you could see this is where we're located. This is the rotunda. This is Pavilion 2. And this is the statue by Moses Ezekiel of Jefferson. This is where that Unite the Right rally was. So it was pretty close to where this is all a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So we had to kind of also contend both with that kind of history, the important historical context of it. But yeah, and so, the other important aspect is that this is a pathway northward. The whole thing is oriented to the north, and a pathway northward to freedom, which every stone represents, every year that there was an enslaved community at the school. So this gives you a sense. So it starts very low and then rises up to kind of enclose into a kind developed by this space. So it was tricky. There's drainage issues. There were all kinds of complicated issues precisely because of the slope, but it also kind of gave us a sense of kind of hugging the space and really, building up an enclosure within the space. The Outer Ring's exterior, artist Eto Otutigbe became interested in layering the information that we had gleaned from our conversations and visits to historic sites and archives, and photographs of people enslaved like Isabella Gibbons. Also interested in the kind of textures. These are the rough tombstones, right? This is like a bush hammering of granite. This is in the Daughter of Zion Cemetery, right? So the things of thinking about the stonemasons, the brick masons, the kind of labor of those who would have been enslaved, the vertical quarry marks on the stone, all became ways of sort of thinking about how we could mark the materials that we were working with. We chose a granite Virginia mist from actually a local quarry in Culpeper, Virginia, and it's a granite that is used actually on the rotunda as paving on an upper level. So it's a beautiful stone because it has a range. It can be, depending on how you polish it, could be very, very dark gray, almost black, or almost go to a very light gray. So it has an incredible range depending on how the surface is treated, right? And so we were interested in how the traces mark the presence of labor that is typically rendered invisible, especially the labor of women like Isabella Gibbons, the laundresses, the cooks, right, whose traces are perhaps a bit more ephemeral, right? And so her eyes became one way of marking, right, the figure. And so we worked with Cora Stone in Madison, Wisconsin, on a fabrication process for the memorial. And we basically made a lenticular image of Isabella Gibbons' eyes. That's one of the things we were interested in Eto's work, that he had come up with a kind of a way of making a 3D, a lenticular image so that it looks one thing one way and another thing another. But Eto's pieces are about this big. It's another thing when you're talking about a massive piece of granite. But working with Cora, we were able to come up with the software and the parametric carving technique, right? Because it's a parabolic curve, so how to carve that, right, and to have this image to be accurate, took a lot of work between the architects and Eto, our architects at the university, who were phenomenal, and Cora Stone, right? But this kind of gives you a sense of how that worked, and it's a double layered. They're the vertical marks of the lenticular image, but then there's also a bush hammering, and these two things come together, right? And so it's this kind of overlaid pattern. And this is what happens. So this is what's produced. And so you could see, her eyes, which sort of appear and disappear. And visitors, when they approach the memorial, they sometimes will see it, depending on the mood of the sky or how one approaches. Sometimes if it's cloudy, you can't see it. And we wanted to honor Gibbons both as a witness for and a watcher of her community that brings their lives, known and unknown, to ours. Right. Along with the representation, right, so this is how we resolve the question of figure, but she's a figure that's there and not there. A narrative of events is also this is, you tell the date of this happened and this big battle, or, so the date of events, a narrative of events are integral to this Western memorial or monument form. So in the memorial bench that you see is a timeline and a water feature that captures the attention of visitors who learn a very different historical narrative of the university, right? The university, because it's Thomas Jefferson, everything is about Mr. Jefferson. And so, we created a timeline that really centered the experiences of the enslaved community, juxtaposing lives where people learned and loved with a landscape of toil and trauma, right? And so you could see here in 1850, 3 students attack a 12-year-old enslaved girl in a field near UVA. The students are expelled. 1853, Isabella Gibbons, a cook who works in a pavilion kitchen, marries William Gibbons, a butler enslaved by another UVA professor. They teach themselves to read and write, right? So it's a very quotidian, sort of everyday narrative of who's there. 1850, 93 enslaved African Americans live and work at the university. 42 are held by professors, 37 by hotel keepers, and another 14 by UVA. People were also rented, so people could be rented for a day or a week to do specific tasks from nearby plantations. Right. And as a witness for her community, Isabella Gibbons' remembrance that was published in the Freedmen's Record concludes the historical timeline. So the timeline ends with her death, a free woman, and then this is her remembrance of what it meant to be a life enslaved. And that whole thing is covered by water. Now, the other interesting challenge is to kind of think about this question of marking time, right? Of how one engages the archive of slavery. And so my colleague, Saidiya Hartman, in her really important essay, Venus in Two Acts, says, I want to tell a story of two girls capable of retrieving what remains dormant, the purchase or claim of their lives on the present, without committing further violence in my own act of narration. It is a story predicated upon impossibility, listening for the unsaid, translating misconstrued words, and refashioning disfigured lives, and intent on achieving an impossible goal, redressing the violence that produced numbers, ciphers, and fragments of discourse, which is as close as we can come to a biography of the captive and enslaved, right? And so for us, it was like, how might we imagine building spaces for remembering or suturing together the past from the archives and sites of slavery at UVA, which still bears the traces of physical violence in the archives of enslavement. And so paraphrasing Hartman, can we retrieve in the memorial of UVA's enslaved community what remains dormant, the purchase or claim of their lives on the present, without committing further violence in our own act of architectural and spatial narration of the past, right? So Saidiya is writing about history writing, but we're making this sort of spatial narrative, but this concern is there, still there. Like, are we also committing a kind of violence toward the enslaved? And I'll explain exactly why that might be. So lastly, this question of names, right? We keep hearing, you gotta name names. We need to know the names of people. But to tell the story of this community required that we engage with an archive of work letters and personal letters. That's how you find out, or wills, of the slave owners, right? And such, it's an archive of daily life that is laced with silences and haunted by violence, right? You know, and you could see, it's just mentioned, rented, 2 extra hands at Christmas. We don't know who they were. $2.50, they did not go to the hands, most likely went to the owners, right? So there's a way in which the name never appears, and often when you're enslaved, there is no last name. You're just Johnny, or you're Sam, or you're Isabella. There's no last name because by severing your last name, it allows you to then be moved as property from person to person. Your last name gives you kinship. It shows you belong to a family. But when you belong to someone else, family doesn't typically matter in these instances, right? And so historians at UVA estimate that about 4,000 men, women, and children built, labored, and lived at UVA in that period. And you can see on the spreadsheet, we found records for about 889, and records meaning like extra hands at Christmas, or Isabella Gibbons was here, or Sam cleaned X, right? So at least we had references. We have no understanding of exactly who the rest of them. Now, 889 references, we know mostly just the first name, and that's about 577 community members, and a handful of people like Isabella Gibbons, Henry Martin. We know first names and last names, and that's often because they stayed around, they stayed around the university, and so they were recorded in other ways. But we still had this 300, right, and 11 that we didn't know who they were, like the extra hands, right? And so we substituted kinship relations and occupation to remember their lives. And so we represented, right, the rest of the remaining unknown unknowns, those we had no sense of who they are or what they were, by what we called a memory mark. And so it's a sort of gash in the granite. So there's a representation of something that they were there, but we don't know who they are, right? And they're unknowns. You could see them. And it is still possible that names can be added. So this was Thrimpston Hearn's family. Oops, I think this is out, yeah. So this was Fanny Gillette Hearn. She was enslaved, part of Thrimpston. So there have been now names that are added, right? So the memory marks holds the potential of a name being added. And this was in January of 2021. And that came through descendants, right? So as you walk into the memorial, you become enveloped by a genealogical cloud of names, social relations, and memory marks. And erased across the surface is their story, albeit a fragmented one. And that's sort of what it looks like. If you look at the renderings of the project, the names were actually in columns. And we realized that if we put them in columns, that is exactly the same form as the ledger, right? And that's why it was a question of like, all right, are we just, again, repeating the sort of violence of the ledger by putting them in that formation? And that's why it's sort of spread out more like a constellation of the memory marks, the gashes in the granite. And here you could see, this is grandmother, this is a janitor, a woodcutter, first name Jack. Here you see Isabella Gibbons, Roberta. So you could read this as a community, as a family, you sense of who they are and what they do. And so we tried to really rehumanize the experiences of the enslaved, and you can really see them. There's a fiddler, there's one in there, and we replace all of the marks around the unknown that does record the violence of the erasure, because something was erased in all 4,000, right? And sometimes the marks, we didn't realize this, speak back, sometimes with tears to their descendants and us. So we didn't realize that actually the way we designed the gash would hold water, and that there's this sense that the wall weeps. Something unknown. So in 2023, Meejan, Eric, and I worked with a data artist, Josh Bagley, to again kind of address what to do or how to work from this archive of slavery. We were asked to join a group of projects by the director of that year's Architecture Biennale, Leslie Loco, to address the question of the mnemonic of memory. And so our installation, Unknown Unknown, occupies the limits, edges, and seams of Western traditions of commemoration. And so we were interested in asking what cannot be remembered and about whom we cannot know, right? And so we were interested in to try to dematerialize the Western monument form into textures of space, light, and sound. And so Unknown Unknown responds to what geographer Katherine McKittrick imagines as, quote, a totally different system of geographic knowledge that cannot replicate subordination precisely because it was born of and holds on to the unknowable. Right. So again, we return to that trove of documents that we use for our research. I mean, we literally had files in the computer of images, of all kinds of documents that we pulled from everywhere that the university gave us. And so in contrast to the typical stone or bronze monument that uses figures, names, and dates to record, right, a kind of timeless historical narrative, Unknown Unknown constructs an ephemeral sonic, so sound, visual, like what a visual field looks like, but also haptic, thinking about the feel of tactility of UVA's enslaved community. And the starting point was to, again, deconstruct this spreadsheet of names and dates that in many aspects replicated the form and structure of the 19th century ledger. So, this is the ledger, but this is also the ledger in which we kept track of, this is Charles Bonnycastle's will, and this tells us Betsy, 1930. That's how we got all the names, right? And then that's how we were able to put all those names onto the surface of the memorial. Right. These are some of the images that we had, aerial views, paintings and drawings from the period, drawings of the pavilions, these famous drawings of the rotunda. So these were all parts here. You see, this little the postcard I showed you. And so we really used this archaeological documentations and letters and receipts and ledgers, also B-roll footage of UVA's grounds to sort of build a kind of new virtual archive of the enslaved community. So along with this visual archive that I just showed you, we also created an archive of voices and sounds, and we invited 3 descendants of the enslaved community, Datisa Gathers, Colleen Yates, and Jessica Harris, to join scholar Saidiya Hartman and Eliza Kelly to read the names of their ancestors, both known and unknown.
Nelson, unknown. Charles, unknown. Malid, unknown. Patsy, unknown. John, unknown. Jack, unknown. Jim, unknown. Unknown, unknown.
So their voices are overlaid onto a 6-channel audio to create a binary sort of sonification of the spreadsheets. So fragments of data generate a bass note that repeats, and it sounds an atonal metronome of known and unknown, and this is what it sounds like. So in the space that we were given in the Arsenale, in the back of the Arsenale, we use Gibbon's letter. Can we forget? And repeated it again and again like a chorus. And so it occupies these sort of 2 spaces, these archways in the space that we're in. And so it's repeated multiple times in this sort of luminescent gold paint. There's 2-sided multi-channel video and audio projection on suspended sheets of muslin, a cotton fabric that recalls the labor of the domestics, of the women, the unnamed Black women at UVA, and the spaces where they worked and lived. So thinking about the laundresses, the seamstresses. So if the physical monument is really about the stonemason and the brick and really spoke to the work, let's say, of the men, this was, that's what I mean, that women's labor is often invisibilized. So the handmade tactility and the material nature of the suspended fabric panels changes an ordinary cloth into a kind of memorialized artifact. And so by forming a kind of counter-archive of sounds and image fragments, Unknown rehumanizes the captive and the enslaved by rendering their unknowability into moments of refuge and spaces of liberation. So the fact that we may not know anything about those 31, maybe that is their space of liberation, right? We don't have to know their suffering. We don't have to know what their kinship, how their kinship might have been severed.
Wyatt, unknown. Primus, Holly, unknown. The John Edwards, unknown. Unknown. Robin,
William Green. Jack, unknown.
Matt, unknown.
Betsy Vines.
Jack,
Unknown. Alfred, unknown. Unknown.
Primus, unknown.
Jim, unknown.
Unknown.
Joseph, unknown.
Daniel,
unknown,
unknown.
Unknown.
Zechariah, unknown.
Absalom,
Phil,
Zach.
unknown.
unknown, unknown.
Moses,
Jerry, unknown. Kitty
Zachariah.
Jones,
Ryland, unknown.
unknown, unknown.
Henry,
John
unknown.
Smith,
William. Unknown.
Primus,
Unknown. Unknown.
Jack,
John,
unknown,
Nelson.
unknown.
Unknown.
unknown, unknown.
Pleasant.
Fleming.
Unknown.
Washington, unknown.
Cassandra,
Unknown.
John,
unknown.
unknown.
Jack. Unknown.
Billy,
Wyatt,
unknown.
Stephen Bowles.
John, unknown.
Unknown.
Amy. Unknown.
Unknown,
Unknown.
John.
Unknown.
unknown, unknown.
So each project has a story to tell, and through these historical and spatial narratives, rich and complex lives unfold through material fragments in ephemeral and haptic mark-making and in the imaginations of both readers and visitors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you. That was incredibly timely and super fascinating, a lot to think about. Rather than listen to me talk anymore, I think we should take some questions. If you've got questions, please raise your hand and we'll bring some microphones to you so that we can all hear them. We've got a few minutes. It's quite tight.
I know, it's really hard. There's a question.
Hi, my name's Bella. I was wondering, do you have any possibly other pieces of installations, architecture that you feel kind of coincide and maybe tell another narrative that you're interested in or further the one that you spoke of today? And thank you so much for coming to lecture for us.
I mean, do you mean my work or other people's work?
Yours or anyone else's.
Oh, other people's work. Well, I will say the Noah Davis show is pretty special. You know, they're all portraitures, portraits of people and places. And it's interesting because I didn't know his work was that attentive to architecture. Like he thinks a lot about modern architecture of Los Angeles, the architect Paul Williams. Yeah, and it kind of like, it's very collage-like, which is something I've always been interested in. And so I really love the show that's up now. One person that I learned a lot from and I admire is my uncle, who's an artist named John Outerbridge. And he was a Los Angeles artist who did sort of part of the California assemblage movement, and for many years he ran the cultural center at Watts Towers in LA. And a lot of his work sort of is kind of rooted in family and what he learned growing up very poor in the South in the 1930s and 40s, about how to make a way out of no way, how to be very creative with what you have. That, you know, his work and that of his peers, Betty Saar, David Hammonds, you know, have been, I think, you know, influential and important, you know, just for thinking through work. So, thank you. That's a great question.
I don't know if this is going to work, but thank you for your lecture today. But I was wondering, outside of the rally in 2017, was there any other pushback that you received from the community when you were working on this project?
Yeah, I mean, any project you work on, there are always going to be, yeah, I mean, you know, this is one of the things that you have to just learn, even if you have a private client. It's always negotiation. You know, we had community ambassadors that were going out and talking. There were school teachers who were talking to students. We went to churches and had breakfasts after services. We did a survey online. You know, I met with a group of alumni in DC. There were like, we had many constellations of people out trying to draw in people's opinions about the memorial. And I think we got the project because we didn't come in saying that we knew. We were going to help the university figure it out. And that was because there was no site. I didn't go into all of the but there was no site, and there was no budget. So, you know, so in that short period of time, we really had to come up with something, you know, that they, you know, and we had to figure this out through multiple sites. And so it was a lot to try to manage in a very short period of time. But we walked into, this had been going on for at least 4 years prior to us. There was a community outreach committee. There was something called the President's Commission to Study Slavery at the university, the PCSU. So they had already been doing archaeological digs. They had been going through letters and, you know, all kinds of materials and the collections and speaking with people. They had discovered there was a slave burial ground actually adjacent to the cemetery of the university. So all of this stuff had already happened when we walked in. So there was already a kind of abundance of materials and connections, but also I think we recognized that we really had to kind of send out all of these to really hear from. I would suspect some people are like, why are we spending all this money on this memorial when the money could go, let's say, to scholarships, right? There, you know, in the meetings, for example, we finally figured out where we were going to site it, but what we heard back was this beautiful abstract white model, but people were not feeling it. And they were like, we want to see people. Where are the people? You know, and there was a guy passing out cards who did bronze statuary, and we were like, no, we're not doing the bronze statues of enslaved people. But we did hear that we had to figure out some way of having some kind of figure on that, which is how we brought Eto into the project to do that. And it was very important. So, you know, I would just say it was very much a kind of process of listening and, of being heard. You know, and it has not been without controversy. There was a member of the board of visitors, I don't know if he's still there, but the university guides were very keen on incorporating the history of slavery and also the memorial into the tour of the university, and that would include for students. And I guess it made people uncomfortable, and this person on the board said, you can't do that anymore. The university guides were no longer able to give student tours because they refused. They said, no, we're giving, this is the history, we know this is the history, this is important for people to know. So, you know, and this was just recently, this was like 2 years ago, or a year ago, that all of this happened. So, yeah, and then one more moment, there is a descendants community, they're a nonprofit, and they didn't like our landscape plan. And they did not like the fact that we put the memorial in a grove of trees to evoke a hush harbor, which are the spaces where the enslaved fled in order to, you know, practice burial rites or to plan insurrections or even escapes. And they were like, why are you trying to hide Isabella Gibbons? You know, this was like, we don't trust the university. So there are no trees on the site. I don't know where those trees went. They had been ordered from, you know, a nursery in Richmond, but they did not end up on the site. So, you know, that was the kind of context. But I think we had really good partners. The university architects were phenomenal, the landscape architect. Yeah, and there were a lot of people deeply committed to seeing this happen at the university. And it was, it was a model for, I think, for public process, on how to engage, and was being used by Andrea Douglas, who just is working on a project called From Swords to Plowshares. She got, she was given the Robert E. Lee statue, and has been melted down into bronze ingot, which will go to artists to make something out of that very contentious statue. And so her public process was modeled on what we did, actually. So it's nice to know that on many fronts the project was productive. But I feel like the thing that I'm most grateful for is that the descendant community lays claim to that site. And I think that's very important.
We have time for one more question right here.
Hi. You mentioned earlier in the presentation the concept of whiteness territorializing its power. Is that a concept that you guys were really conscious about responding to or subverting in the two projects you showed?
That's more of a historical reference, but you can say, if you look at the segregation of the city of Charlottesville, that Lee statue was placed when McIntyre, who is very, very, very wealthy graduate of the University of Virginia, gifted sort of four statues to the city. Lee, Jackson, he's the brother of the famous explorer. Yeah, but it's the other, it's not, it's Clark's brother. One of their brothers was also a very famous, yeah. And so he purchased land specifically adjacent to a black community to put that Robert E. Lee. So it was meant to intimidate, because this was also a moment at which all of those people who had remembered the Civil War were dying. By 1920, right, that whole that who were adults, and that was dying out, right? And so there needed to be, and this is well documented, a kind of regime of territorialization and literal terror. This resurgence of the Klan in the 1920s, to claim space, right? And to have these statues looming over so that you can remember where your place needs to be. So it's a kind of, the same way, I was saying that on grounds, people were terrified. If they did something where they would be beaten, you could be sold. You could be kidnapped and lynched. You don't know, and you don't want to find out, right? And that of the slave codes was just kind of scripted into Jim Crow laws, right? But those are spatial paradigms. And so these monuments kind of play into that kind of landscape of terror. And so that's what I mean. And I mean whiteness in the sense, I mean whiteness as a regime of power, right? And I don't typically use white people because I think you can be, this is my poster child for whiteness is Clarence Thomas, who has lived his life as knows deprivation, impoverished, poor, and yet understands what he benefits from, right? By embracing a kind of regime of basically of domination. Yeah, so that's what I mean.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any burning last quick question? Okay.
Oh, in the front.
You don't want to cut it too short.
Here I go. Hi, my name is Ita, and my question comes from you talked about human commemoration practices and how you used non-Western commemoration practices. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about your non-Western commemoration practices that you employed with the Venice Biennale exhibit.
I think we questioned Western commemoration practices. Eto, in particular, was interested in scarification. That's where his, and he was interested in that specifically because there's the scar of the famous image of, that's apparently been banned, I always forget the name of that image of the man who had these horrible scars on his back from being beaten, right? So that, again, the duality, the scar can mean the trace of violence, or the scar can be a sign of beauty, particularly in Western African, right? Ritual practices, or the idea of a libation, right? And so the idea of pouring water to the dead, those are Africanisms that end up in, the diasporic culture, right, that come from continent cultures. And so we were interested in kind of thinking about how, that could shape a kind of ritualistic practices at the site itself, right? And so that gathering space can be a space for performance, for many different ways in which, the museum can be animated. I mean, the memorial can be animated, right, by the people who come. So, great question. Thanks. All right, thank you all.
Thank you again. All right, well, thank you all for being here, and thank you once again. That's it for Arfaa 2025-2026, right? So we wrap up with our themed year. We will put together a slate for next year. If you would like to watch this again or share it, it will appear on the YouTube channel in a week or two for the college. All right? So thanks again, and thanks one more time, Mabel, for joining us.
Oh. Good luck wrapping everything up.